There's a pandemic we're not talking about. It didn't arrive in 2020, and it won't be solved with vaccines or social distancing. This pandemic has been spreading for generations, moving silently through families, communities, and entire societies. It lives in the bodies of adults who can't understand why they feel anxious for no reason, why they sabotage their own success, why intimacy feels terrifying, or why they wake up exhausted despite sleeping through the night. This pandemic began in childhood and is still raging today. We call it normal. We call it life. We call it just the way things are. But what if the struggles you face today, the patterns you can't seem to break, the emotional pain that feels like it has no source, what if all of this began decades ago, in moments you might not even remember? What if the greatest public health crisis of our time isn't the virus at all, but the accumulated weight of childhood wounds that we've learned to carry in silence? This is the conversation we need to have, not because it's comfortable, but because our survival depends on it. The survival of our emotional well-being, our relationships, our capacity to live authentically, and perhaps most importantly, the well-being of the next generation depends on our willingness to look at this truth. When we think of pandemics, we think of something visible, something that can be tracked and measured, something with clear symptoms that everyone can see. But what happens when the symptoms are invisible? What happens when they're so normalized that we mistake them for personality traits? What happens when an entire culture is built on the foundation of unhealed childhood pain and we've forgotten what health actually looks like? The statistics tell part of the story. Studies suggest that at least 2/3 of adults have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. These aren't just extreme cases of abuse or neglect. These are the everyday wounds that happen in ordinary families, in good homes, with well-meaning parents. A father who was emotionally unavailable because he was working 3 jobs to keep the family afloat. A mother who was physically present but emotionally absent because she was drowning in her own unprocessed pain. A household where feelings weren't discussed, where crying was seen as weakness, where children learned to hide their true selves to maintain peace or earn approval. But numbers can't capture the felt reality of this. They can't describe what it's like to be a child whose needs for emotional attunement go unmet, day after day, year after year. They can't express the particular loneliness of growing up in a home where you're fed and clothed but never truly seen. They can't quantify the impact of learning before you even have words for it, that your authentic self is somehow not acceptable, not safe, not enough. This is the pandemic we're living with. And unlike biological viruses that our immune systems can fight, these wounds don't heal with time alone. They adapt, they transform, they become the blueprint for how we navigate the world as adults. They become the anxiety we can't explain, the depression that seems to come from nowhere, the relationships that follow the same painful patterns, the success that never feels quite enough, the exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure. Understanding childhood trauma isn't about blaming parents or dwelling in victimhood. It's about understanding the truth of how human beings develop, how our nervous systems are shaped, how our capacity for emotional regulation is formed, and how the wounds we sustain in our earliest years continue to influence us in ways we rarely recognize. It's about acknowledging that we all carry these wounds to some degree, that they're not signs of personal weakness or failure, but the natural consequence of growing up in a world that doesn't fully understand what children actually need. The word trauma itself often confuses us. We think it means something extreme, something that happens to other people, something dramatic and obvious. But trauma, in its most fundamental sense, is simply what happens when our capacity to cope is overwhelmed. For a child, this can happen in ways that adults might never even notice. A parent's prolonged absence, a move to a new home, the arrival of a sibling, a medical procedure, a parent's depression, a household filled with unspoken tension. These experiences might not seem traumatic from the outside, but to a child's developing nervous system, they can be overwhelming. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Children are meaning-making creatures. When something overwhelming happens, when their needs aren't met, when they feel unsafe or unseen, they don't conclude that the situation was problematic or that the adults in their lives were struggling. They conclude that something is wrong with them. This is the child's survival strategy. It's safer to believe you're the problem than to believe the people you depend on for survival are unreliable. So the child adapts. They learn to be smaller, quieter, more helpful, more independent, more invisible, whatever it takes to maintain the connection they need to survive. These adaptations are brilliant in childhood. They help us survive situations we couldn't otherwise endure. But they become our prison in adulthood. We carry them forward, applying childhood survival strategies to adult situations that don't require them. We people please our way through life, unable to set boundaries or express our needs. We achieve relentlessly, trying to earn the sense of worth we never received unconditionally. We avoid intimacy because closeness learned to equal disappointment or hurt. We numb ourselves with work, substances, food, scrolling, shopping, anything to avoid feeling the feelings we learned weren't safe to feel. This is how childhood wounds become a pandemic. They spread not through physical contact, but through generations. Parents who never healed their own wounds unconsciously pass them to their children, not through malice, but through the simple fact that we can't teach emotional skills we never learned. We can't provide attunement we never received. We can't model healthy boundaries if ours were never respected. The cycle continues, and with each generation, the collective burden grows heavier. What makes this so difficult to see is that it's everywhere. When a pattern is universal, it becomes invisible. When everyone is carrying unprocessed childhood pain, we mistake it for normal human experience. We develop entire cultural narratives that frame these trauma responses as virtues. We celebrate the workaholic, not recognizing that their relentless productivity might be a desperate attempt to earn worth. We admire the person who never asks for help, not seeing that their independence might be a defense against the vulnerability of needing others. We praise the person who's always taking care of everyone else, not understanding that their caretaking might be how they learn to earn love. Our economic systems, our social structures, even our ideas about success and happiness, all of these are built on foundations that don't account for this reality. In fact, many of them actively exploit it. Consumer culture thrives on our unmet needs, promising that the next purchase will finally fill the emptiness. Hustle culture capitalizes on our shame, telling us we're not enough until we achieve more. Diet culture feeds on the disconnection from our bodies that trauma creates. Social media monetizes our desperate need for validation and connection. We're not just dealing with individual wounds, we're dealing with a traumatized culture that has organized itself around avoiding the pain rather than healing it. And in that avoidance, we've created systems that perpetuate the very wounds we're trying to escape. But here's what we need to understand, and this is crucial. Recognizing that childhood is the source of so much adult suffering isn't about resignation or despair. It's actually the doorway to liberation. Because once we understand that our struggles today are rooted in adaptive responses we developed decades ago, we can begin to update those responses. We can start to heal. The human nervous system is incredibly resilient. Our brains maintain plasticity throughout life. The patterns that were set in childhood aren't permanent fixtures. They're more like deep grooves worn into a path through repeated use. Yes, it takes effort to create new pathways, but it's absolutely possible. The first step is simply seeing the grooves for what they are, recognizing that the anxiety, the perfectionism, the fear of abandonment, the difficulty with intimacy, these aren't character flaws or personality defects. They're adaptations. They're how a brilliant, resourceful child learned to survive. Let's talk about what actually happens in childhood that creates these lasting impacts. It starts with a simple biological fact. Human infants are the most dependent creatures on Earth. Unlike other mammals who can walk shortly after birth, human babies require years of intensive care to survive. This isn't a design flaw. It's what allows our large, complex brains to develop. But it also means that our early experiences literally shape the architecture of our developing nervous systems. A baby's brain is forming at an astonishing rate, creating millions of neural connections every second. Which connections get reinforced and which get pruned depends entirely on experience. If a baby cries and someone comes consistently offering comfort and soothing, that baby's brain learns that the world is responsive, that their needs matter, that connection is available. Their nervous system develops with a baseline of relative safety. They learn to regulate their emotions through co-regulation with caregivers who help them move from distress back to calm. But if a baby cries and no one comes, or if the response is inconsistent, unpredictable, or itself frightening, something different happens. That baby's nervous system learns that the world is unpredictable or dangerous, that their needs might not be met, that they're alone with overwhelming feelings. They don't develop the neural pathways for effective emotional regulation because they never had the opportunity to practice it within the safety of an attuned relationship. This early wiring doesn't determine destiny, but it does create a foundation. It shapes what feels normal, what feels safe, what our nervous system expects from the world and from relationships. A child who experiences consistent attunement will likely find it easier to trust others and to regulate their emotions as an adult. A child who experienced inconsistency or neglect will likely struggle with trust and emotional regulation, not because they're flawed, but because their nervous system was shaped by different experiences. And here's where it gets more complex. It's not just about whether basic needs were met. It's about attunement, about whether the child felt truly seen and understood. You can have parents who provided food, shelter, education, even affection, but if they were unable to attune to your emotional world, if they couldn't tolerate certain feelings or couldn't see your authentic self, wounds still form. Attunement means a parent can recognize what their child is feeling and respond in a way that helps the child understand and integrate that feeling. It means being present not just physically but emotionally. It means being able to tolerate the full range of your child's emotional experience without needing to shut it down, fix it, or make it about yourself. This is extraordinarily difficult because it requires that the parent has done their own emotional work. You can't stay present with your child's big feelings if you're terrified of your own. Most parents do the best they can with the resources they have, but parenting is happening within larger contexts. Parents are often stressed, overwhelmed, under-supported, and dealing with their own unhealed wounds. A parent working multiple jobs to make ends meet might be physically exhausted and emotionally depleted, with nothing left to give at the end of the day. A parent struggling with depression or anxiety is fighting their own internal battles. A parent who never learned emotional skills can't spontaneously develop them just because they've had children. This is why understanding childhood as a pandemic means looking at more than just individual families. It means examining the social conditions that make good enough parenting so difficult. It means acknowledging that we've created a culture that isolates families, that doesn't adequately support parents, that prioritizes economic productivity over human well-being, that treats children's emotional needs as secondary concerns. In many indigenous cultures, child-rearing was a communal activity. Parents had support, children had multiple attachment figures, and the entire community participated in raising the next generation. But in modern Western culture, we've created this nuclear family model where one or two adults are expected to meet all of a child's needs while also working, managing a household, and maintaining their own well-being. It's an impossible task, and most parents are exhausted and overwhelmed as a result. So when we talk about childhood trauma, we're not just talking about what happened in your specific home. We're talking about what happens when an entire culture fails to support the fundamental needs of children and families. We're talking about the trauma of growing up in a society that doesn't truly value emotional health, that treats children's inner lives as less important than their academic achievement or behavioral compliance, that medicates normal responses to abnormal circumstances rather than addressing those circumstances. Let's consider what children actually need for healthy development. They need safety, both physical and emotional. They need to be seen and known for who they actually are, not who their parents need them to be. They need to have their feelings validated and helped to move through them, not shut down or punished for having them. They need adults who can tolerate their own emotions so they don't need the child to manage those emotions for them. They need consistency and predictability. They need to know that relationships are stable and that love isn't conditional on performance or behavior. They need opportunities to explore and individuate while maintaining secure connection. They need to experience themselves as valuable simply for existing, not for what they do or achieve. When these needs aren't met, and again, they're rarely fully met for anyone, children develop strategies to cope with the gaps. These strategies become so automatic that by adulthood, we're not even aware we're using them. We just think this is who we are. Some children cope by becoming hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environment for danger or disapproval. As adults, they might experience chronic anxiety, always waiting for something to go wrong, unable to relax, even in safe situations. Their nervous system learned that threat could come at any moment and that survival depends on constant watchfulness. Other children cope by numbing out, by disconnecting from feelings that were too overwhelming or that weren't safe to express. As adults, they might feel emotionally flat, struggle to access feelings, or need intense experiences to feel anything at all. They might describe feeling like they're watching their life from outside themselves, never fully inhabiting their own experience. Some children cope by becoming achievers, learning that their value comes from performance. As adults, they might be incredibly successful by external measures, but feel empty inside, always pushing toward the next goal, but never feeling it's enough. They've internalized the message that their worth is conditional, that love has to be earned through achievement. Others cope by becoming caretakers, learning that the way to maintain connection is to manage other people's emotions and needs. As adults, they might struggle to identify their own needs, feeling guilty anytime they prioritize themselves. They've learned that relationships require them to be smaller, to put others first, to earn their place through service. Some children cope by becoming invisible, learning that the safest strategy is to need nothing and take up no space. As adults, they might struggle to assert themselves, to ask for help, or to believe they matter. They've internalized the message that their needs are burdensome, that they're too much or not enough. Others cope through dissociation, through leaving their bodies when things get overwhelming. As adults, they might feel disconnected from physical sensations, struggle with being present, or feel like they're just going through the motions of life without fully inhabiting it. These aren't conscious choices. They're survival strategies that a brilliant, resourceful child developed because they had no other options. And they're all connected to the nervous system's fundamental responses to threat: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. When children can't fight and can't flee because they're dependent on the very people who might be the source of overwhelm, they freeze or fawn, they shut down, or they become hypercompliant. These responses get wired in, becoming automatic patterns that continue long after they're needed. The challenging truth is that most of us learned these patterns in homes where nothing obviously terrible happened. There might have been love, there might have been good intentions, but there were also gaps. Maybe a parent was emotionally unavailable. Maybe feelings weren't discussed. Maybe affection was conditional. Maybe the family system required the child to take on an inappropriate role. Maybe there was chronic stress or instability, even if the parents were doing their best. This is crucial to understand because many people dismiss their own pain, thinking it doesn't count as trauma because their childhood wasn't overtly abusive. But trauma isn't just what happens to us. It's also what didn't happen. It's the attunement that wasn't there, the emotional support that was missing, the sense of safety that never quite formed, the permission to be fully oneself that was never granted. In psychological terms, we talk about attachment styles, patterns of relating that form based on early experiences with caregivers. Secure attachment develops when children experience their caregivers as consistently available, responsive, and attuned. These children learn that relationships are safe, that their needs matter, that they can depend on others. They develop the capacity to both maintain intimacy and tolerate independence. They can regulate their emotions effectively and have a generally positive view of themselves and others. But when those early experiences are inconsistent, unavailable, or frightening, different attachment patterns form. Anxious attachment develops when care is inconsistent, when sometimes the parent is responsive and sometimes they're not. These children become hypervigilant about relationships, always worried about abandonment, always seeking reassurance. As adults, they might struggle with jealousy, need constant validation, or have difficulty tolerating separation. Avoidant attachment develops when emotional needs are consistently dismissed or when the child learns that vulnerability is dangerous. These children learn to suppress their needs and become self-reliant. As adults, they might struggle with intimacy, keep people at a distance, or feel uncomfortable with emotional expression and closeness. Disorganized attachment develops when the caregiver is both the source of comfort and the source of fear, when a child needs to approach the very person they need to flee from. This creates an impossible bind that often results in profound confusion about relationships. As adults, people with disorganized attachment might experience intense fears of both intimacy and abandonment, chaotic relationships, and difficulty trusting anyone, including themselves. These attachment patterns aren't fixed destinies, but they are powerful influences. They shape who we choose as partners, how we behave in relationships, what feels normal or safe, and what triggers our deepest fears. And they all trace back to those early experiences, to whether our childhood environment supported healthy emotional development or inadvertently created wounds. If this message resonates with you, consider subscribing so we can walk this healing path together. Let's talk about what these childhood wounds look like in adult life, because recognition is the first step toward healing. One of the most common manifestations is people-pleasing. If you learned in childhood that love and safety depend on keeping others happy, on anticipating and meeting their needs, on never being a burden, you might find yourself in adulthood unable to say no, constantly overextending yourself, feeling responsible for other people's emotions, and losing yourself in relationships. You might not even know what you actually want, because you spent so much energy figuring out what others want from you. People-pleasing isn't kindness or generosity. It's a survival strategy. It comes from a place of fear, a belief that your value depends on your usefulness, that if you stop taking care of others, you'll be abandoned or rejected. It's exhausting because it requires constant vigilance, constant monitoring of other people's states, constant adjustment of yourself to maintain connection. And it ultimately prevents real intimacy, because you're never bringing your authentic self to relationships. You're bringing a carefully curated version designed to be acceptable. Another common pattern is perfectionism. If you learned that love was conditional on achievement, that mistakes were unacceptable, that your worth depended on performance, you might find yourself driven by an impossible standard. Nothing you do is ever quite good enough. You focus on flaws rather than accomplishments. You procrastinate because starting something means risking failure. You burn out repeatedly but keep pushing because stopping feels like giving up on yourself. Perfectionism isn't about high standards or wanting to do well. It's about trying to earn worth through achievement, about believing that if you could just be good enough, work hard enough, accomplish enough, then you'd finally be acceptable, finally be enough. But the finish line keeps moving because the problem isn't your performance. The problem is that you learned your value was conditional in the first place. Then there's emotional avoidance. If you learned that feelings weren't safe, that vulnerability was weakness, that you needed to handle things on your own, you might find yourself in adulthood disconnected from your emotional life. You might be able to think about feelings, but not actually feel them. You might stay extremely busy to avoid being alone with yourself. You might use substances, work, exercise, food, technology, any number of things to numb or distract from what's happening inside. This avoidance makes sense as a survival strategy. If the adults in your life couldn't handle your feelings, if emotional expression led to punishment or withdrawal, if you were overwhelmed by feelings and had no one to help you regulate, then learning to disconnect was adaptive. But in adulthood, emotional avoidance cuts us off from vital information about ourselves and our needs. It prevents authentic connection and often leads to physical symptoms as the body tries to express what the mind won't allow. There's also the pattern of recreating familiar dynamics. We're drawn to what feels familiar, even when it's painful, because familiarity feels like safety to our nervous systems. If you grew up with emotional unavailability, you might find yourself repeatedly attracted to partners who are distant or commitment phobic. If you grew up walking on eggshells, you might find yourself in relationships where you're constantly managing someone else's volatility. If you grew up feeling responsible for others, you might repeatedly end up in caretaker roles. This isn't masochism or poor judgment. It's the nervous system seeking what it knows. There's a strange comfort in familiar pain. And unconsciously, we're often trying to recreate and master the dynamics that wounded us. We tell ourselves this time will be different, this person will change, this time we'll get it right. But until we address the underlying wounds, the pattern continues. Chronic shame is another hallmark of unhealed childhood wounds. Shame isn't the same as guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. If you internalize the message that something was wrong with you, that you were too much or not enough, that your authentic self was unacceptable, you might carry a baseline feeling of wrongness or defectiveness. This shame often operates beneath conscious awareness, influencing everything from the career you pursue to the relationships you allow yourself to have. Shame tells us we don't deserve good things, that we need to hide our true selves, that if people really knew us, they'd reject us. It drives perfectionism, people-pleasing, and self-sabotage. It makes it difficult to accept compliments or acknowledge our own needs. It keeps us small and invisible, or drives us to overcompensate through achievement and performance. And it's incredibly resistant to logic or reassurance because it was formed before we had language wired into our neural pathways through thousands of early interactions. Then there's the disconnection from the body. Trauma lives in the body long after the mind has forgotten or moved on. If you learn to disconnect from physical sensations as a way to cope with overwhelming experiences, you might find yourself in adulthood chronically tense, but unaware of it until someone points it out. You might struggle to identify hunger, tiredness, or other bodily cues. You might experience chronic pain or illness that seems to have no clear physical cause. You might feel like you're living in your head, cut off from the felt sense of being in a body. This disconnection is a survival mechanism. When being in your body meant feeling things that were too overwhelming or experiencing things that were too painful, leaving the body made sense. But this strategy has costs. Our bodies hold wisdom and information. They tell us when something is wrong, when we need to rest, when we're in danger, when we feel joy. Without access to these signals, we're navigating life without crucial information, often pushing past our limits until we collapse. Many of these patterns involve a fundamental loss of self. When we had to adapt ourselves to maintain connection and safety as children, we learned to suppress or hide the parts of us that weren't acceptable. We developed what's sometimes called a false self, a version of ourselves designed to meet others' needs or expectations. The true self, with its authentic desires, feelings, and needs, gets buried so deep that many people reach adulthood not even knowing who they really are. This loss of self manifests in countless ways. Not knowing what you actually enjoy versus what you think you should enjoy. Constantly looking to others to know how to think or feel about something. Feeling empty or lost when you're alone. Making life decisions based on what others expect rather than what feels right for you. Living a life that looks good on paper but feels hollow. This isn't selfishness or lack of maturity. It's the consequence of never being allowed to develop an authentic sense of self in the first place. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may support someone else's journey. The painful truth is that our culture often reinforces these trauma-based patterns. We're told that self-sacrifice is noble, that putting ourselves last is virtuous, that never showing weakness is strength. We're told that worth comes from productivity, that our value is measured by achievement, that we should be independent and never need help. We're told to just think positive, to get over it, to be grateful for what we have. These cultural messages echo and reinforce the wounding messages many of us received in childhood, making it harder to see that there's another way to live. But there's another way. And it starts with what we're doing right now, looking honestly at how childhood shapes us, recognizing the patterns we carry, and understanding that these aren't character flaws but adaptations to circumstances we couldn't control. Understanding is powerful, but it's not enough on its own. These patterns aren't maintained by conscious thoughts that we can simply think differently about. They're held in the body, in the nervous system, in implicit memory that doesn't respond to insight alone. This is why many people can understand their childhood wounds intellectually but still find themselves repeating the same patterns. Healing requires engaging with the body, with the nervous system, with the implicit memories and automatic responses that were formed before we had language. It requires creating new experiences that teach the nervous system something different, that provide the corrective experiences that were missing in childhood. And it requires tremendous compassion for ourselves, for the wounded child within, who's still trying to protect us, using strategies that no longer serve. The process of healing often begins with simply noticing. Noticing when you're people-pleasing, noticing when perfectionism is driving you, noticing when you're emotionally shutting down, noticing when you're recreating a familiar, painful dynamic. This noticing isn't about judgment or self-criticism. It's about bringing awareness to automatic patterns. You can't change what you can't see. As you notice these patterns, you can begin to get curious about them. What am I feeling right now? What do I need? What is this pattern trying to protect me from? What would I have needed as a child in a moment like this? This curiosity helps create a bit of space between the trigger and the automatic response, space where choice becomes possible. Then comes the practice of befriending your body, learning to tune into the signals and sensations that you might have spent years ignoring or suppressing. This might start with simple practices like noticing your breath, feeling your feet on the ground, or scanning your body for tension. It might involve movement practices like yoga or dance that help you inhabit your body more fully. It might include working with modalities like somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy that specifically address trauma held in the body. The nervous system heals through experiences of safety and connection. This means creating relationships where you can practice being more authentic, more vulnerable, where you can risk showing parts of yourself you learned to hide. It might mean finding a therapist who can provide the attunement you didn't receive as a child. It might mean building friendships where you practice asking for support or setting boundaries. It might mean joining a group or community where you feel genuinely seen and accepted. Self-compassion is essential to this process. For many people, this is the most challenging aspect of healing because it directly contradicts the shame and self-criticism that was internalized in childhood. Self-compassion means treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend. It means recognizing that your struggles are part of the human experience, not signs of personal failure. It means understanding that you were doing the best you could with the resources you had. When you notice yourself in a pattern, rather than judging yourself, you might try saying something like, "Of course I'm doing this. This made sense when I was young. This was how I learned to survive. I understand why this pattern is here." And then you can gently explore whether there's a different choice available now. A choice that honors your current adult capacity rather than your childhood limitations. Healing also involves grieving. Grieving the childhood you didn't have, the attunement you didn't receive, the safety you couldn't feel, the authentic self you had to hide. This grief isn't about self-pity or blame. It's about acknowledging the reality of what was and what wasn't. When we can grieve these losses, when we can feel the sadness and anger that we might have suppressed for decades, we create space for something new to emerge. Many people resist this grief, thinking it means they're ungrateful or that they're blaming their parents. But grief and gratitude can coexist. You can appreciate what your parents did provide while also acknowledging what was missing. You can understand that they did their best while recognizing that their best wasn't enough to meet all your needs. This both-and thinking is crucial because childhood was rarely all good or all bad. It was complex, with moments of love and moments of hurt, sometimes from the same people in the same day. As healing progresses, you begin to develop what's called earned secure attachment. Even if your early attachment experiences were insecure, you can develop the internal capacity to provide yourself with some of what you didn't receive. You can learn to attune to your own emotions, to soothe yourself when distressed, to stay present with difficult feelings, to trust yourself and others more fully. This doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't erase the past, but it does change your relationship to it. You start to recognize triggers not as evidence of brokenness, but as information. When you feel that surge of anxiety or that impulse to people please, instead of automatically following it, you can pause and ask, what's actually happening right now? Is there real danger? Or is my nervous system responding to an old pattern? Do I actually need to take care of this person's emotions? Or am I falling into an old role? You develop the capacity to distinguish between past and present, to recognize when you're reacting to ghosts rather than current reality. This growing awareness also changes how you understand others. When you recognize your own wounds and patterns, you begin to see them in everyone around you. That angry boss might be operating from their own childhood fear of losing control. That needy friend might be desperately trying to get needs met that were neglected decades ago. That distant partner might be protecting themselves the only way they learned how. This understanding doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior, but it does change the lens through which you view it. Boundaries become clearer as you heal. When you were operating from wounds, Boundaries might have been rigid, keeping everyone at a distance to protect yourself. Or they might have been non-existent, allowing everyone access because you didn't believe you had the right to protect your space and energy. As you heal, you develop flexible boundaries, the ability to discern who and what is safe, to let in nourishment while keeping out harm, to say yes when something serves you and no when it doesn't. The relationship with yourself changes fundamentally. Instead of being your own harshest critic, you become an ally to yourself. Instead of abandoning yourself when things get hard, you stay present. Instead of suppressing needs and feelings, you listen to them as important information. Instead of performing to earn worth, you begin to inhabit your inherent value. This doesn't mean you become perfect or that you never struggle. It means you're no longer at war with yourself. As this internal shift happens, external life often changes too. Relationships that were built on old patterns might not survive your healing. Some people were only comfortable with the wounded version of you. Career paths, chosen to please others or prove worth, might stop making sense. Living situations that required you to be small might become unbearable. This can be disorienting and sometimes painful, but it's also a sign of growth, evidence that you're no longer willing to abandon yourself to maintain comfort or familiarity. Subscribe to stay connected with future reflections and healing explorations. The work of healing is not linear. There will be days when you feel like you've made no progress, when old patterns resurface with full force, when the wounds feel as fresh as they did decades ago. This is normal. Healing moves in spirals, not straight lines. You might work through something only to find yourself facing it again at a deeper level. This doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're deepening, accessing layers that weren't available before. What's important is developing a different relationship to these difficult moments. Instead of seeing them as proof that you're broken or that healing doesn't work, you can recognize them as part of the process, as opportunities to practice new responses, to offer yourself the compassion and support you're learning to provide. Each time you meet an old pattern with new awareness, you're rewiring neural pathways, creating new possibilities. The broader cultural implications of understanding childhood as a pandemic are profound. When we recognize how widespread unhealed childhood wounds are, when we see how they manifest in everything from individual suffering to systemic dysfunction, it becomes clear that addressing this isn't just personal work, it's collective work. It's about changing how we organize society, how we support families, how we treat children, how we value emotional well-being. Imagine a culture that truly prioritized children's emotional needs. What would that look like? It would mean supporting parents with paid leave, affordable childcare, mental health resources, and community connections. It would mean schools that recognize emotional development as at least as important as academic achievement. It would mean healthcare that addresses the roots of physical symptoms in trauma and stress rather than just medicating symptoms. It would mean workplaces that honor human needs for rest, connection, and meaning rather than demanding constant productivity. It would mean changing how we think about discipline and behavior, recognizing that children acting out are communicating distress, not choosing to be difficult. It would mean understanding that challenging behaviors are often trauma responses and require compassion and support, not punishment. It would mean adults examining their own triggers and wounds so they don't unconsciously repeat patterns with the next generation. This cultural shift requires that adults do their own healing work. We can't create a trauma-informed society if the adults running it haven't addressed their own wounds. Every teacher, doctor, therapist, parent, leader, every person in a position to influence others carries the responsibility to examine their own patterns and do their own healing work. Not because they need to be perfect, but because unexamined wounds inevitably get transmitted to others. This isn't about individual blame. It's about collective responsibility. We're all swimming in these waters together, all shaped by cultures and systems that don't adequately support human development, all carrying wounds that weren't our fault but are our responsibility to address. The question isn't whether you have childhood wounds. Everyone does to some degree. The question is what you're going to do about them. Some people resist this work, thinking it means dwelling in the past or making excuses for current problems. But looking at childhood wounds isn't about staying stuck there. It's about understanding why you are the way you are, so you can make conscious choices rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. It's about freeing yourself from repeating the past so you can actually inhabit the present. Others resist because they're loyal to their parents, worried that examining their childhood means betraying or blaming the people who raised them. But understanding how your parents' limitations affected you doesn't require condemning them. Most parents truly did the best they could with what they had, but their best might not have been what you needed. And acknowledging that isn't cruelty, it's truth. You can hold compassion for their struggles while also honoring your own pain. Some people resist because the idea of all this work feels overwhelming. How can you address something so fundamental, so wired into your being? Won't it take forever? The truth is that healing does take time, but time will pass anyway. You can spend it unconsciously, repeating patterns, or you can spend it gradually freeing yourself from them. And healing isn't about reaching some final destination where you're completely healed and have no more work to do. It's about shifting your relationship to yourself and your wounds, about gaining more choice and freedom, about living more authentically. The invitation here isn't to make healing your life's work in a way that keeps you focused on wounds forever. It's to do the healing work so you can stop living from your wounds and start living from your wholeness. It's to process and integrate what happened so it no longer controls you. It's to reclaim the authentic self that had to be hidden or suppressed so you can actually live your life rather than performing one designed to keep you safe in circumstances that no longer exist. And here's something crucial. This work isn't just for you. Every time you heal a pattern, you break a chain of transmission. Every time you choose a different response than what was modeled for you, you create a possibility for those around you to do the same. When you do your healing work, you change what you pass on to the next generation. If you have children, you become less likely to unconsciously wound them in the ways you were wounded. If you don't have children, you still affect every relationship you're in, every community you're a part of. This is how we begin to address the pandemic of unhealed childhood wounds. Not through some top-down intervention, though cultural changes matter, but through individuals committing to their own healing and, in doing so, changing the collective field. One person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, we can create a different way of being. The work requires courage because it means feeling things you might have spent your entire life avoiding. It means being honest about pain you might have minimized or dismissed. It means sitting with discomfort rather than immediately trying to fix or escape it. It means letting people see you in ways that feel terrifyingly vulnerable. It means disappointing some people as you stop contorting yourself to meet their expectations. It means grieving losses you can never get back. But it also offers something precious. The possibility of living authentically, of knowing yourself, of experiencing genuine connection, of inhabiting your own life fully. It offers freedom from the tyranny of patterns you didn't choose. It offers the chance to discover who you actually are beneath the adaptations and defenses. It offers the possibility of finally feeling at home in yourself. You deserve this. Not because you've earned it or proven yourself worthy, but simply because you exist. Your childhood self, who adapted so brilliantly to survive circumstances they couldn't control, deserves compassion and healing. Your current self, who is still carrying those adaptations even when they no longer serve, deserves support and understanding. Your future self deserves the freedom that comes from doing this work. The pandemic of childhood wounds doesn't need to continue indefinitely. It continues because we don't recognize it, because we normalize it, because we treat symptoms rather than addressing roots, because each generation unconsciously passes wounds to the next. But you can be the one who breaks the pattern in your lineage. You can be the one who says, this stops with me. I will do the work to heal what I can heal, to understand what shaped me, to choose differently going forward. This doesn't mean you'll be perfect. You'll still make mistakes, still have hard days, still sometimes fall back into old patterns. But you'll do so with awareness, with compassion, with the capacity to repair and reconnect rather than just repeating. You'll have choices where before you only had automatic reactions. You'll have access to your full self rather than living from a limited, defended version. The path of healing is not easy, but it is profoundly worthwhile. It's the most important work you can do, not just for yourself, but for everyone your life touches. It's an act of courage and an act of love. It's a gift to yourself, to your relationships, to the next generation, to the broader culture that desperately needs people who have done this work. As we close this exploration, I want to acknowledge how difficult it might have been to take in this information, especially if it's bringing up awareness of your own childhood experiences that you've never looked at this way before. That discomfort, if you're feeling it, is actually a sign that something true is being touched. Your resistance or sadness or anger, whatever is arising, deserves compassion and space. Remember that understanding childhood wounds isn't about blaming your parents or feeling sorry for yourself or staying stuck in victimhood. It's about understanding. It's about recognizing that the struggles you face today have roots, have origins, have causes that weren't your fault. This understanding is liberating because it means you're not inherently broken or defective. You're carrying adaptations that made sense given what you experienced. And it means you can heal. The patterns that were set in childhood can be shifted in adulthood. The wounds that formed in relationship can heal in relationship. The nervous system that learned threat can learn safety. The heart that learned to protect itself can learn to open again. The authentic self that went into hiding can gradually emerge. This is the promise of doing this work. Not that you'll become perfect or never struggle again, but that you'll be free to live from choice rather than compulsion, from wholeness rather than wounds. The pandemic of childhood wounds is real. It's widespread, and it affects virtually everyone to some degree. But unlike biological pandemics where we're waiting for medical solutions, this healing is already available. It's in the choice to look honestly at your patterns, to feel what needs to be felt, to practice self-compassion, to seek support, to gradually shift your relationship to yourself and others. It's in the daily practice of choosing differently, of offering yourself what you didn't receive, of slowly rewiring decades of conditioning. You're not alone in this. Millions of people are walking this path, doing this work, healing these wounds. Some are doing it in therapy rooms, some in support groups, some through spiritual practices, some through creative expression, some simply through the daily practice of showing up for themselves differently than was modeled. However you approach it, you're part of a collective shift, a cultural awakening to the importance of this work. So if you're hearing this and recognizing yourself in these patterns, if you're feeling the weight of your childhood in new ways, if you're sensing that there might be another way to live, trust that knowing. Trust that the part of you that's listening to this message is the part that wants to heal, that's ready to heal, that deserves to heal. Honor that by taking whatever next step feels manageable, whether it's finding a therapist, joining a support group, starting a mindfulness practice, or simply beginning to notice your patterns with more compassion. The work of healing childhood wounds is perhaps the most important work of our time. It's how we break cycles of suffering. It's how we create lives of authenticity and connection. It's how we build a culture that truly supports human flourishing. And it starts with you, with your willingness to look at your own story with honest, compassionate eyes, and to do what needs to be done to heal. Thank you for being here, for listening, for being willing to consider these ideas. If this resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so we can continue these explorations together. Healing happens in community, in connection, in a space where we can be honest about our struggles and our hopes. Your healing matters, not just for you, but for all of us. We need people who have done this work, who understand these wounds, who can help create a different way of being in the world. May you find the courage to face your wounds with compassion. May you find the support you need for this journey. May you discover the freedom that comes from healing what was hurt long ago. May you know, in the deepest part of yourself, that you are worthy of this healing, deserving of this freedom, capable of this transformation. The wounded child within you has been waiting a long time to be seen and held and helped. Today can be the day you begin to offer that to yourself.